In the first moments of 1942, the world was changing at the speed of a dive bomber. The old empires of Europe were collapsing in Asia, their flags torn down and replaced by the stark red sun of Imperial Japan. From the jungles of Malaya to the shores of the Philippines, from the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies to the remote islands of the vast Pacific, the armies and navies of Emperor Hirohito seemed invincible. The soldier of Imperial Japan was the product of a system designed to forge the individual into a component of a divine national will. He was steeped in a modernized version of the ancient samurai code of Bushido. For him, the highest honor was death in service to the emperor. Surrender was the ultimate dishonor, a stain upon one's family and ancestors for generations. He endured brutal training, a dehumanizing ordeal intended to strip away fear, compassion, and self-preservation, replacing them with unquestioning obedience and a profound belief in Yamato Damashi, the unique, superior fighting spirit of the Japanese race. After years of bloody campaigns in China, followed by the lightning-fast conquests of Western colonial territories, this belief had curdled into a dangerous sense of arrogance. The Japanese military was afflicted with what historians would later call victory disease. They saw their triumphs as proof of their spiritual and racial supremacy. And in this worldview, the American was the absolute antithesis of the Japanese warrior. He was seen as an individualist, not a collectivist, a creature of comfort raised on jazz music, Hollywood films, and chocolate bars. He was a shopkeeper, a farmer, or a factory worker, not a warrior born of a divine lineage. The Japanese High Command looked at the United States, a nation still reeling from the Great Depression, and saw a decadent, materialistic society that had lost its warrior ethos. They believed the American soldier, when faced with the true, terrifying face of war, would break. His spirit was considered brittle and his will to fight shallow. This profound underestimation was a foundational pillar of Japan's entire war strategy, but it was a miscalculation of catastrophic proportions. Because in the summer of 1942, on a remote jungle-choked island that few in the world had ever heard of, this theory of American softness was about to be put to the ultimate test. The Japanese were about to meet the United States Marine Corps. August 7th, 1942. Under the oppressive tropical sun of the Solomon Islands, the men of the 1st Marine Division stared at the coastline of Guadalcanal. After the national humiliation of Pearl Harbor and the string of demoralizing defeats that followed, they were the first to carry the fight back to the enemy. They were the embodiment of a nation's desperate need to stop falling back and finally punch back. As their Higgins boats churned toward the shore, they expected a bloodbath. But the landing was eerily quiet. The beaches were undefended. The Japanese construction force, tasked with building a vital airfield on the island's Lunga coastal plain, was caught completely by surprise. They abandoned their equipment, their barracks, even their half-eaten bowls of rice, and fled into the dense malarial jungle. Within 36 hours, the Marines had seized their primary objective, the nearly completed airfield. They promptly renamed it Henderson Field in honor of a Marine aviator killed at the Battle of Midway. They had taken the ground, but their position was precarious. Days later, a disastrous naval engagement known as the First Battle of Savo Island forced the US Navy fleet to withdraw, taking with it many of the Marine supplies and all of their heavy equipment. Major General Alexander Vandergrift and his 1st Marine Division were, for all intents and purposes, stranded. They were isolated on a hostile island with dwindling ammunition, meager rations, and a determined enemy gathering in the jungles around them and on the islands beyond. News of the American landing sent a shockwave through the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters. Lieutenant General Harukichi Hayokutake, commander of the 17th Army in Rabaul, saw the Marine presence as a minor but insolent problem that needed to be dealt with swiftly. Operating under the same victory disease mindset that permeated the High Command, he saw no need for a major counteroffensive. Why waste an entire division on a few thousand soft Americans? Instead, he would dispatch an elite, fast-moving unit to deal with the problem. He would send the best. The task fell to Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki and the 1st Battalion of the 28th Infantry Regiment, a unit known simply as the Ichiki Detachment. These were the cream of the Imperial Japanese Army. They were veterans of the Malayan Campaign and the Battle of Singapore, where they had helped humiliate the British Empire. They were regarded as experts in amphibious landings and rapid jungle assaults. Colonel Ichiki himself was a zealous infantry purist. As a former instructor at the Chiba Infantry School, he was a doctrinal author of the very tactics he was now meant to employ. His tactics stipulate that the key to victory lay in the aggressive, unrelenting offensive, and that the bayonet was the supreme instrument of the warrior's spirit. Loaded onto fast destroyers, Ichiki and his men were ferried to Guadalcanal. He confidently predicted they would mop up the enemy in a matter of days. This supreme overconfidence led him to make a series of fatal errors. He ignored suggestions to avoid frontal attacks, he discounted intelligence suggesting the Marines numbered well over 10,000, and he chose not to wait for the second half of his regiment to arrive. He would handle this himself, with the 900 men he brought ashore. The glory would be his alone. On the night of August 21st, after a grueling march through the jungle, Ichiki's detachment arrived at the eastern edge of the Marine perimeter. The line was held by the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Edwin A. Pollock. His men were dug in along the west bank of a sluggish, sand-choked river the natives called the Ilu. To history, it would forever be known as Alligator Creek. As darkness fell, Colonel Ichiki gave his orders. Under a moonless sky, his men fixed their bayonets. With officers leading the way, samurai swords drawn, they prepared to unleash the terrifying spiritual force that had broken every enemy they had ever faced. Shouting, "Tenohei ka banzai, long live His Majesty the Emperor," the first wave of the Ichiki detachment surged out of the jungle and onto the narrow sandbar, charging directly into the heart of the Marine line. The screaming wave of attackers was met by a disciplined storm of fire. From a sandbagged gun pit, Corporal Leroy Diamond and Private First Class Al Schmidt of H Company opened up with their M1917 water-cooled Browning machine gun, sweeping the sandbar with methodical horizontal bursts. All along the line, Marine riflemen, many of them holding their fire until the enemy was within 100 yards, fired with lethal precision. The banzai charge, a tactic designed to create a psychological collapse, instead ran headlong into an equation of industrial age lethality. The first wave was annihilated. The second wave met the same fate. Colonel Ichiki, in a state of disbelief, furiously committed his reserves, ordering them to wade across the river itself. It was a suicidal move. The Marines had positioned their 37mm anti-tank guns, loaded with canister shot, effectively turning them into giant shotguns to cover the river. They fired, and the water erupted, shredding the charging soldiers. The battle became a slaughter. The Japanese officers, identifiable by their swords, were systematically targeted and killed. The Nambu light machine guns of the Japanese were no match for the sustained heavy fire of the water-cooled Brownings. Private Schmidt's machine gun position became a focal point of the Japanese attack. A grenade blast blinded him, but he continued to fire, with his loader, Corporal Diamond, shouting directions into his ear, telling him where to traverse the gun. He fought until a Japanese soldier managed to crawl close enough to shoot him with a rifle, shattering his arm. Even then, the position held. It's estimated that their position was responsible for the deaths of up to 200 Japanese combatants. The battle raged for hours, a one-sided massacre illuminated by the flashes of gunfire and explosions. As dawn approached, the firing tapered off. The sun rose to reveal a scene of unimaginable carnage. The sandbar at Alligator Creek was piled 3 and 4 deep, with the bodies of Japanese soldiers, tangled in the barbed wire, cut down in the surf. The river itself was choked with the dead. Colonel Pollock ordered a counterattack. Light tanks rumbled across the sandbar, firing into the jungle, hunting down the few remaining survivors who refused to surrender. They were met with grenades and rifle fire until every last pocket of resistance was silenced. Of more than 900 men in Ichiki's detachment, a little under 800 lay dead. Only 15 were taken prisoner, most of them unconscious. The rest had vanished into the jungle, wounded and demoralized. Colonel Ichiki, utterly disgraced, burned his regimental colors and performed seppuku. The Battle of the Tanaru was a brutal, shocking education for the Japanese. The reports that eventually made their way back to Rabaul were met with disbelief. It was simply incomprehensible that the finest soldiers of the Emperor could be so thoroughly and effortlessly annihilated. The myth of American softness, the core belief that their fighting spirit was brittle, had been shattered in a single night. For the Japanese military, the American Marine was no longer a second-rate amateur. He was a determined, deadly, and dangerously capable opponent. The initial contempt was gone, replaced by a grudging, shocked respect. In a letter recovered by US forces on Guadalcanal, a Japanese soldier described the Marines as a special force recruited from jails and insane asylums for bloodlust. The 15 months that followed the brutal awakening at Guadalcanal were a period of immense growth for the American war machine. The United States was building, planning, and preparing to unleash an industrial fury the world had never conceived of. The strategy that emerged was island hopping, a pragmatic and ruthless campaign to seize vital airfields and anchorages on a direct path to Japan, leaving vast garrisons of Japanese troops to wither on the vine. In the autumn of 1943, the crosshairs of this new strategy settled on the Gilbert Islands, and specifically on a minuscule sliver of coral in the Tarawa atoll named Betio. Betio was, by any measure, insignificant. 2 miles long and barely half a mile wide, its highest point was less than 10 feet above sea level. But upon this flat coral pancake, the Japanese had constructed a masterpiece of defensive engineering. It was intended to make the price of every island so horrifically high that America would lose its stomach for the war. Betio was a fortress, designed to be the ultimate killing ground, a meat grinder that would chew up the advancing American forces. The commander of this island fortress was Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, an engineer as much as a warrior, and under his meticulous direction, nearly 5,000 men, including the elite 3rd Special Base Force and a detachment of the Special Naval Landing Forces, had turned the island into a layered defense of breathtaking complexity. Hundreds of pillboxes and machine gun nests, built from reinforced concrete, coconut logs, and steel plates, created interlocking fields of fire that covered every inch of the beach. The entire island was ringed with a necklace of obstacles like barbed wire, anti-tank ditches, and a submerged wall of mines and coral obstructions. Admiral Shibasaki had analyzed the American landings at Guadalcanal and was determined not to repeat the mistakes made there. Looking out at the turquoise waters of the Pacific, he declared that it would take the Americans 1 million men and 100 years to take Tarawa. He was off by 99 years, 362 days, and about 982,000 men. The 2nd Marine Division was coming. On the morning of November 20th, 1943, the sea and sky around Betio erupted. A massive pre-invasion fleet of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers unleashed a deafening, earth-shaking bombardment that systematically pounded the tiny island for nearly 3 hours. From the ships of the invasion fleet, it was an awesome spectacle of destruction. It seemed impossible that anything or anyone could survive such a cataclysm. For the Japanese defenders hunkered deep within their bunkers, it was a terrifying ordeal. The world became nothing but darkness, concussion, the shriek of incoming shells, and the sickening feeling of being buried alive. But Admiral Shibasaki's engineering held. The majority of these heavily reinforced bunkers and pillboxes remained intact. When the naval gunfire lifted to allow the Marine landing craft to approach, the dazed but determined Japanese soldiers scrambled back to their machine guns and cannons. A critical miscalculation by American naval intelligence had failed to account for a neap tide. The waters over the jagged coral reef surrounding the island weren't deep enough for the Marines' Higgins boats. Hundreds of yards from the shore, the landing craft ground to a halt, stuck fast on the reef. The ramps went down, and the men of the 2nd Marine Division were forced to disembark into chest-deep, then waist-deep water. They were exposed, slow-moving targets caught in a perfectly sighted kill zone. Those lucky enough to be carried in Amtraks were able to climb up and over the coral and make it to the beach, only to be met with withering machine gun fire and no armor plate to defend themselves. From the firing slits of their bunkers, the Japanese defenders could scarcely believe their good fortune. They opened fire, and the tranquil lagoon instantly transformed into a churning cauldron of machine gun traces, mortar explosions, and artillery shells. Marines fell by the dozen, then by the 100. The advance became a horrific, slow-motion crawl through a curtain of steel, a desperate wade through water-stained crimson with the blood of their comrades. This was the moment the Japanese expected the attack to break. This was the moment the soft Americans were supposed to panic, turn back, and be annihilated in the surf. But this is where the first seed of a new kind of fear began to sprout in the minds of the defenders. The Marines didn't stop. They simply kept coming. With a grim, seemingly inhuman determination, they lowered their heads and leaned into the storm of fire, climbing over their own dead to gain another precious yard. It was a relentlessness that seemed to defy all logic of self-preservation. It was terrifying. Some Marines were brought ashore by a new vehicle, the tracked LVT, or alligator, which could crawl over the reef. But there were not nearly enough of them. The majority of the first waves were decimated, yet a handful of men, then a dozen, then 100, somehow survived the wade and reached the relative cover of a low sea wall. Pinned down, with their units shattered and their commanders often dead, they began the real fight for Tarawa. For 76 hours, the battle was an intimate, brutal affair of extermination. The Japanese defenders, secure in their bunkers, were now faced with the second element of this new American terror: overwhelming point-blank fire. M4 Sherman tanks that made it ashore became mobile fortresses, rolling directly up to the firing slits of Japanese pillboxes and blasting them apart with their 75mm cannons. Marine demolition teams, armed with satchel charges, would crawl under fire to the blind spots of the bunkers and toss their explosive packages into the apertures, vaporizing the occupants. But the most feared weapon, the one that would become the stuff of Japanese nightmares, was the M2 flamethrower. For a soldier sealed in the suffocating darkness of a concrete pillbox, its arrival was the end of all hope. It was a weapon of pure, primal horror that struck a deeper fear than any bullet or shell. The battle devolved into a methodical, bunker-by-bunker annihilation. The constant pressure was immense, a grinding, unstoppable tide of violence that gave the defenders no rest, no time to regroup, no hope of reinforcement. Admiral Shibasaki himself was killed on the first day when naval gunfire struck his command post. When the island was finally declared secure, the cost was laid bare. The fortress of Betio had been cracked open and gutted. Of the nearly 5,000 elite Japanese defenders, only 17 Japanese soldiers and 129 Korean laborers were captured alive. The rest had fought to the death, but the price they had extracted from the Marines was shocking. More than 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded for a piece of land smaller than New York's Central Park. The Japanese had killed many Marines, but they hadn't stopped them. They hadn't even slowed them down for that long either. The grim arithmetic of the battle was terrifying. If the Americans were willing to pay such a steep price for a strategically minor atoll, what price would they be willing to pay for the islands that truly mattered? The perception of the US Marine had now evolved far beyond grudging respect. He was seen as an agent of an unstoppable industrial behemoth, a nation that could absorb casualties that would cripple any other army and simply keep coming. He was a foe whose core characteristic was a terrifying, relentless momentum. The feeling was no longer respect. It was now a cold, gnawing dread. And on the next island, that dread would fester into absolute terror. By the first months of 1945, the brilliant red sun on the horizon of the Pacific was a setting one. The vast empire, conquered in a storm of lightning victories, was crumbling. The Imperial Japanese Navy was a shattered remnant resting on the ocean floor. The Philippines had fallen, and from newly captured airfields in the Mariana Islands, massive silver fleets of American B-29 superfortresses were now flying regular missions to strike the ultimate target, the Japanese home islands themselves. These missions were long and perilous. Damaged bombers, struggling to return to base, had nowhere to land. Fighter escorts could only accompany the bombers part of the way. A staging point was needed, an emergency landing strip and a base for long-range fighters. American strategic planners scanned the map and their eyes fell on a tiny pork-chop-shaped island of volcanic rock situated almost exactly halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. Its name was Iwo Jima. The man chosen to defend this piece of Japan was Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. An aristocrat by birth and a poet by hobby, Kuribayashi had served as a military attaché in the United States and Canada. He had traveled the country, studied its industrial centers, and observed its people. He didn't share the contemptuous, dismissive view of Americans that had been so common among his peers in 1942. He had seen the sprawling factories of Detroit and the endless fields of the Midwest. He knew that America's industrial power was a sleeping giant, and now that giant was fully awake and enraged. General Kuribayashi had meticulously studied the battles that had come before. He had read the after-action reports from Tarawa, from Saipan, from Peleliu. He understood the United States Marine. He knew that the Marine was relentless, that he was equipped with overwhelming firepower, and that he would pay any price in blood to take his objective. From this grim understanding, Kuribayashi arrived at a chilling and revolutionary conclusion. He couldn't defeat the Americans. The battle for Iwo Jima was unwinnable. A conventional defense of trying to stop the Marines on the beaches, as was done at Tarawa, would be a pointless slaughter. The traditional, final banzai charge was, in his view, a useless squandering of precious lives. So he devised a new strategy, a strategy born of a desire to inflict maximum casualties. His entire plan was an acknowledgement of the terrifying reputation the Marines had now earned. His goal was pure attrition. He would make the cost of Iwo Jima so catastrophically high, so horrifically bloody, that the morale of the American public would finally break. He would kill so many Marines that Washington would lose its will to demand unconditional surrender. His defense was not designed to stop the Marines, it was designed to bleed them to death. To achieve this, he turned the island itself into a weapon. He forbade the tactics of the past and ordered 21,000 defenders to dig in. Under his command, Japanese engineers and Korean laborers blasted, dug, and clawed over 11 miles of interconnected tunnels deep within the island's soft volcanic rock. This was a subterranean fortress, a labyrinth that connected thousands of hidden caves, pillboxes, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. His men would fight and die in their positions, using the tunnels to maneuver, resupply, and attack the Marines from unexpected directions, often from behind after a position was thought to have been taken. The Japanese army on Iwo Jima would be an almost invisible enemy, fighting from the very bones of the island. On February 19th, 1945, after the most intensive naval bombardment of the entire Pacific War, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches, and they were met with a strange, eerie silence. Kuribayashi had given his gunners a strict order: hold your fire. He watched from his command post deep within Mount Suribachi as the beaches filled with thousands of Marines and hundreds of vehicles, all struggling to move in the coarse, black volcanic ash that bogged down men and machines alike. He waited until the landing zones were choked with targets, a chaotic mass with nowhere to go. Then he unleashed the storm. From every hidden position on Mount Suribachi and the northern plateaus, his artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened up at once. The silent beaches became a volcanic hell of explosions and crisscrossing fire. The Battle of Iwo Jima had begun. For the next 36 days, it would be a descent into a unique kind of nightmare. A war of extermination fought against an enemy that lived underground. It's here, in the diaries and letters found on the bodies of Japanese soldiers after the battle, that we see the final, terrifying transformation in the perception of the Marine. The dread that began at Tarawa had now festered into absolute primal terror. Fighting from the darkness of their caves, the Japanese defenders saw the Marines as something other than human. Covered head to toe in the fine black ash, their faces gaunt from exhaustion and caked with grime, they appeared as demonic figures, rising from the blasted, smoking landscape. The instruments of this terror were the now perfected tactics for destroying fortifications. The corkscrew and blowtorch method became the standard operating procedure. A Sherman tank, modified with a flamethrower, would crawl up to a cave opening and unleash a torrent of liquid fire, incinerating the occupants closest to the entrance. Then, combat engineers would follow, throwing in satchel charges of high explosives to kill anyone left and seal the cave forever. The terror for the Japanese was twofold. It was the terror of the Marines' weapons, but it was also the terror of their seemingly supernatural will. Kuribayashi's strategy was working in one sense. Marine casualties were horrific, the worst in the Corps' history. Units were being shattered and companies reduced to the size of platoons. But they never stopped. They absorbed losses that should have broken the morale of any army on Earth, and they just kept coming. They climbed the treacherous slopes of Suribachi. They blasted their way through the fortified quarry and the hellish terrain of the meat grinder. Every inch of the island was paid for in blood, but every inch was taken. To the Japanese soldiers, isolated, cut off, and fighting in the dark, this relentless advance was incomprehensible. These were not men. Men had a breaking point. These creatures did not. The perception was now complete. The American Marine was no longer a soft soldier or a stubborn material enemy. He was an Oni, a demon, an agent of destruction sent from a hell of fire and steel who could not be stopped. When the guns of the Second World War finally fell silent, the quiet that descended upon the Pacific was one of profound and deafening reflection. The war receded from the headlines and the strategic maps, but it took up permanent residence in the minds of the men who survived, altering their inner landscapes forever. For the United States Marine Corps, the conflict had been a psychological forge, hardening its institutional identity in ways that would last for generations. The war served as a brutal, but ultimately validating confirmation of the Corps' most deeply held beliefs. The unspeakable horrors of Tarawa and Iwo Jima became the defining crucibles of the modern Marine. A powerful conviction was cemented in the institutional soul, that through shared hardship of the most extreme kind, a superior warrior is forged. The immense casualties ceased to be mere statistics. They became sacrifices that purchased a new, almost sacred status for the Corps. This collective memory of suffering created a fierce and protective pride, fueling an obsession with maintaining elite standards. Every future Marine would have to be worthy of the blood that had been spilled in his name. The legend born in the flash of explosions and the grit of volcanic ash became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Marines began to see themselves through the awestruck and terrified eyes of their enemy. The reputation for ferocity was no longer an external observation, but was internalized, becoming a core component of what it meant to be a Marine. The relentless fighting spirit that had shocked the Japanese at Guadalcanal became the unwritten, unbreakable standard for every recruit who would ever stand on the yellow footprints at Paris Island or San Diego. The war had carved a new psychological baseline for the Corps, a permanent expectation of toughness and resilience that it would carry forward. This was the specter of the Iwo Jima Marine that would later haunt the frozen hills of the Chosin Reservoir in Korea, where Marines, surrounded and brutally outnumbered, refused to break and fought their way back from the brink of annihilation. It was the echo of the Tarawa landings that informed the brutal, close-quarters jungle warfare in Hu City and Khe Sanh during the Vietnam War, where the Corps' reputation for stubborn resolve was once again tested in blood. And it was the legacy of the island-hopping campaign that lived on in the deserts of the Middle East, through the lightning assaults of Desert Storm and the gritty house-to-house fighting in places like Fallujah, where the world was reminded of what a Marine rifleman was capable of. The battlefields may have changed, but the psychological foundation forged in the Pacific remained. This transformation was the result of a head-on collision between two irreconcilable worlds. One side was the Japanese soldier, fighting for a spiritual victory, for a beautiful and honorable death in service to a divine emperor. The Bushido Code was an ideology that promised victory through sheer willpower. That ideology shattered when it met the cold, brutal, and terrifyingly pragmatic doctrine of the United States Marine. The individual Marine was the tip of a very long, very sharp spear forged in the roaring factories of a nation fully mobilized for war. He was an infantryman supported by the terrifying symphony of destruction, the thunder of naval bombardments, the precision of dive bombers, the unstoppable advance of Sherman tanks, and the hellish fire of the flamethrower. It was this deluge of steel and fire that systematically crushed the Japanese defenders, nullifying the advantages of their fighting spirit and courage. Ultimately, the modern identity of the US Marine is inextricably linked to the psychological scars of his adversary. The two are sides of the same coin, forged in the same fire. The legend of the Marine Corps wasn't simply written by American war correspondents. It was written by the fearful diaries of Japanese soldiers and confirmed in the shock after-action reports of their officers. The fearsome reputation of the United States Marine Corps wasn't a product of propaganda, it was earned in the most unforgiving classrooms on Earth. It was forged in the jungles of Guadalcanal, hardened on the coral reefs of Tarawa, and finally immortalized in the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. A reputation written in blood and fire and forever etched into the memory of its enemies. So, what do you think? Do you think the Marines' fearsome reputation was earned more by the sheer, unbelievable grit of the individual man? Or was it the overwhelming industrial terror of their war machine that truly broke the spirit of their enemies? And does that brutal legacy from the Pacific still define the Corps today? Let us know all that and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.